Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way. Story 1. The Crying Spirits of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum Maintenance Supervisor, David Rodriguez, had worked at dozens of abandoned buildings throughout his career, but nothing prepared him for his assignment at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia. The massive Gothic Revival structure had been abandoned since 1994, and David's job was to assess the building's condition and oversee basic maintenance to prevent further deterioration. What he discovered inside made him question everything he thought he knew about life and death. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum had operated from 1864 to 1994 as a psychiatric hospital, originally designed to house 250 patients in a therapeutic environment. However, overcrowding led to nearly 2,600 patients being housed in conditions that were anything but therapeutic. The facility became notorious for lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and other treatments that often caused more harm than healing. Thousands of patients had died within its walls over 130 years of operation. David arrived at the asylum on a cold December morning, immediately struck by the building's imposing presence. The structure was enormous, 1,296 feet long and 4 stories tall, making it one of the largest hand-cut stone buildings in North America. The Gothic architecture was both beautiful and intimidating, with towers and battlements that made it look more like a medieval castle than a hospital. After decades of abandonment, many windows were broken, and vegetation was beginning to overtake parts of the exterior. David's first day was spent touring the building to assess its overall condition. The interior was a maze of corridors, patient rooms, treatment areas, and common spaces. Much of the original furniture and equipment remained, creating an eerie time capsule of psychiatric treatment from different eras. David found restraints, electroshock machines, and isolation cells that revealed the harsh realities of historical mental health treatment. The supernatural activity began on David's second day in the building. While inspecting the electrical systems in the basement, he heard what sounded like someone crying in the distance. The crying was human and filled with despair, echoing through the empty corridors in a way that made it impossible to locate the source. When David investigated, he found the basement completely empty, with no explanation for the sounds he had heard. Over the next several days, the crying became a constant presence throughout the building. David would hear individual voices, and sometimes what sounded like multiple people weeping simultaneously. The crying seemed to come from different areas of the building at different times. Sometimes from patient rooms, sometimes from treatment areas, and often from the isolation cells where the most disturbed patients had been confined. David tried to rationalize the sounds as building settling, wind through broken windows, or echoes from outside the building. But the crying was too distinctly human and too emotionally charged to be explained by natural causes. The voices expressed different types of distress. Some sounded like people in physical pain, others like individuals experiencing deep emotional anguish, and still others like children who had been separated from their families. The encounters escalated when David began seeing the sources of the crying. While working in the former women's ward, he saw a female patient sitting on an invisible bed, weeping inconsolably. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a hospital gown from the mid-20th century. Her hair was disheveled, and her face showed the vacant expression that David had learned to associate with over-medication. The woman cried for nearly an hour, while David worked in the area, her sobs echoing through the empty ward. David's research into the asylum's history revealed the tragic circumstances that had led to so much suffering within its walls. Many patients had been committed, not because they were mentally ill, but because they were considered social problems by their families or communities. Women were often institutionalized for conditions like hysteria or postpartum depression, while men might be committed for alcoholism or behavior that challenged social norms. Once committed, patients often remained at the asylum for the rest of their lives. The most disturbing discovery was the treatment methods that had been used at Trans-Allegheny. David found records of thousands of lobotomies performed between 1940 and 1960, often on patients who showed no signs of violent behavior. The procedure was used to control difficult patients rather than treat specific medical conditions. Many patients who received lobotomies were left in vegetative states, unable to care for themselves or communicate with their families. David began encountering the spirits of patients who had received these harsh treatments. In the former surgical suite, he regularly saw the ghost of a man who appeared to have had a lobotomy. His head was partially shaved, and he moved with the slow, disconnected manner that characterized lobotomy patients. The man would wander through the surgical area, as if searching for something he could no longer remember, occasionally touching his head where the surgical scars would have been. The children's ward was the most emotionally challenging area for David to work in. The asylum had housed hundreds of children over the years, some as young as 5 years old, who had been committed for conditions that would now be recognized as autism, developmental delays, or learning disabilities. David regularly heard children crying throughout this area, and occasionally saw young spirits playing with invisible toys, or calling out for parents who had abandoned them to institutional care. One particularly heartbreaking encounter involved a young boy who appeared to be about 8 years old. The child's spirit would sit by a window in the children's ward, apparently watching for someone who never came. David learned from asylum records that the boy matched the description of Timothy Patterson, who had been committed in 1952 at age 6 for what was then called mental deficiency, but would now be recognized as autism. Timothy had lived at the asylum until his death in 1967, never receiving a single visit from his family. David's work in the isolation cells revealed some of the asylum's darkest history. These small windowless rooms had been used to confine patients who were considered dangerous or disruptive. Many patients had spent months or years in these cells with minimal human contact, leading to further psychological deterioration. David regularly heard crying and screaming coming from these cells, and he occasionally saw spirits who appeared to be trapped in endless cycles of confinement. The supernatural activity reached its peak during David's 4th week at the asylum. While working in the main corridor, he witnessed what appeared to be a mass spiritual manifestation. Dozens of patient spirits filled the hallway, representing different eras of the asylum's operation. The spirits appeared to be participating in some kind of daily routine, moving between rooms, interacting with invisible staff members, and following schedules that had ended decades earlier. The manifestation lasted for over an hour, during which David observed the daily life of a functioning psychiatric hospital from the perspective of the patients. He saw spirits lining up for medications, participating in group activities, and interacting with each other in ways that revealed the social structure that had developed among long-term institutional residents. Despite the tragic circumstances of their confinement, the spirits showed moments of friendship, compassion, and mutual support. David's emotional response to these encounters led him to research individual patient stories more deeply. He found files documenting the lives of people who had been forgotten by society and died alone in institutional care. Many patients had been brilliant, creative, or simply different in ways that their families and communities couldn't accept. Their stories revealed the human cost of a mental health system that prioritized social control over genuine healing. The crying spirits, according to David's interpretation, represent the collective grief of thousands of individuals who suffered in an institution that was supposed to help them. Their ongoing presence serves as a testimony to lives that were cut short by harsh treatments, social abandonment, and a medical system that often caused more harm than healing. The spirits are not seeking to frighten the living, but rather to ensure that their suffering is acknowledged and remembered. David completed his maintenance assessment, but continued volunteering at the asylum, which eventually opened for historical tours. He became an advocate for mental health awareness and worked to ensure that the stories of former patients were told with dignity and accuracy. His encounters with the crying spirits convinced him that places of great suffering retain the emotional energy of those who died there, and this energy serves as a reminder of society's responsibility to treat its most vulnerable members with compassion and respect. According to David's experience, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands as a monument to the need for humane mental health treatment and the importance of remembering those who suffered under earlier systems of care. The crying spirits ensure that the lessons learned from this dark chapter in psychiatric history continue to influence modern mental health practice, reminding us that every patient deserves dignity, compassion, and the hope of genuine healing, rather than mere containment.
Story 2. The Lost Souls of Eastern State Penitentiary Correctional Officer turned security consultant Mike Patterson had worked in active prisons for over 20 years before taking a job at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. The historic prison had been converted into a museum and tourist attraction after closing in 1971, and Mike was hired to provide security expertise for the site while it operated as a historical landmark. His experience in corrections prepared him for dealing with difficult people, but nothing had prepared him for encountering the ghosts of prisoners who had died decades earlier. Eastern State Penitentiary had operated from 1829 to 1971 as one of the most influential prisons in the world. It pioneered the concept of solitary confinement as a form of rehabilitation, keeping prisoners isolated in individual cells to encourage reflection and repentance. The reality was far harsher than the theory. Many inmates went insane from the prolonged isolation, and suicide rates were among the highest in the American prison system. Over 1,700 prisoners had died within the prison walls during its 142 years of operation. Mike began working at Eastern State in the fall, immediately impressed by the prison's imposing architecture. The fortress-like structure was designed to intimidate, with massive stone walls, guard towers, and a hub-and-spoke layout that allowed guards to observe multiple cell blocks from a central point. After decades of abandonment, the prison had become a haunting ruin, with crumbling cell blocks, overgrown courtyards, and cells that still contained remnants of prisoners' personal belongings. Mike's first supernatural encounter occurred during his second week on the job. While conducting a security check of cell block 3, he heard what sounded like someone pacing in one of the cells. The footsteps were rhythmic and persistent, suggesting someone walking back and forth in the confined space of a prison cell. When Mike investigated, he found the cell empty, but the footsteps continued for several more minutes before stopping abruptly. The pacing sounds became a regular occurrence throughout the prison. Mike would hear footsteps in different cells at different times, always following the same pattern of restless walking that he recognized from his years working in active prisons. The sounds were most common during the evening hours, matching the time when prisoners would have been locked in their cells for the night. Mike realized he was hearing the spirits of former inmates continuing the behavioral patterns that had defined their years of confinement. As Mike spent more time in the prison, he began seeing the sources of the sounds he was hearing. Phantom prisoners appeared in their cells, pacing endlessly in the small spaces where they had spent years or decades in isolation. The prisoners wore uniforms from different eras of the prison's operation, representing inmates from the 1800s through the 1970s. Most appeared to be unaware of Mike's presence, trapped in endless repetitions of their daily routines. Mike's corrections experience helped him understand what he was observing. The phantom prisoners showed signs of institutionalization, the psychological adaptation to prison life that made long-term inmates dependent on institutional routines and unable to function in the outside world. Even in death, these spirits continued following the patterns that had structured their lives during incarceration. They woke at invisible bells, lined up for phantom meals, and spent hours pacing in their cells. The most disturbing encounters occurred in the punishment cells, where prisoners had been sent for violating prison rules. These cells were smaller and darker than regular cells, designed to increase the psychological pressure of solitary confinement. Mike regularly heard screaming and pleading coming from these areas, and he occasionally saw spirits who appeared to be suffering from severe mental distress caused by prolonged isolation. Mike began researching the individual stories of prisoners whose spirits he encountered regularly. One phantom inmate appeared to be a middle-aged man who spent his time writing at an invisible desk. Through prison records, Mike identified him as James Morrison, who had been imprisoned for burglary in 1923 and had died at Eastern State in 1951 after serving 28 years in solitary confinement. Morrison had been known for writing letters to family members who never responded, maintaining hope for contact with the outside world that never came. The research revealed the devastating psychological effects of the prison's isolation system. Many prisoners had been driven to madness by years of solitary confinement, developing mental illnesses that made their rehabilitation impossible. Some inmates had been held in isolation for decades, losing the ability to communicate normally or interact with other people. When these prisoners died, they often had no family members to claim their bodies, and they were buried in unmarked graves in the prison cemetery. Mike's most significant encounter occurred in cell B38, which had housed Al Capone during part of his sentence for tax evasion. The famous gangster's cell had been furnished more comfortably than standard cells, with a radio desk and oriental rug. Mike regularly saw a phantom figure in the cell who appeared to be listening to invisible radio programs and conducting business meetings with invisible visitors. The spirit seemed to be maintaining the routine and connections that had defined Capone's time at the prison. The supernatural activity extended beyond individual cells to include group manifestations in the prison's common areas. Mike witnessed phantom prisoners gathering in the exercise yard, participating in invisible recreational activities and social interactions. These spirits appeared to be recreating the limited social opportunities that had been available during their incarceration, maintaining friendships and alliances that had helped them survive prison life. The most emotionally challenging encounters occurred in the prison's death row section, where inmates had been held while awaiting execution. Mike heard crying and praying coming from these cells, and occasionally saw spirits who appeared to be in their final hours before execution. The terror and despair of these phantom prisoners was overwhelming, and Mike found these areas of the prison almost impossible to patrol alone. Mike's work at Eastern State expanded beyond security, as he became an expert on the prison's history and paranormal activity. He began participating in the prison's educational programs, sharing his observations with visitors, and helping them understand the human cost of solitary confinement. His corrections background provided valuable context for understanding the psychological effects of the prison's punitive system. The phantom prisoners, according to Mike's interpretation, represent the psychological damage caused by prolonged isolation and harsh prison conditions. Many of these spirits appear to be trapped in cycles of institutional behavior that they developed as survival mechanisms during their incarceration. Their ongoing presence serves as a testament to the dehumanizing effects of prison systems that prioritize punishment over rehabilitation. Mike's encounters with the phantom prisoners led him to become an advocate for prison reform and more humane treatment of inmates. He argued that his supernatural experiences demonstrated the lasting psychological effects of harsh prison conditions, and showed that traditional approaches to incarceration often created more problems than they solved. The spirits of Eastern State represented not just individual tragedies, but systemic failures in the criminal justice system. The prison's conversion to a museum allowed Mike to share these insights with thousands of visitors each year. He would point out areas where he regularly encountered phantom prisoners, and explain how their behavior reflected the psychological adaptation to long-term solitary confinement. Many visitors reported their own supernatural encounters, suggesting that the prison's spiritual activity was accessible to sensitive individuals. According to Mike's experience,
Eastern State Penitentiary serves as a powerful reminder of the need for criminal justice reform and more humane treatment of incarcerated individuals. The phantom prisoners continue to walk the cell blocks not because they are evil or dangerous, but because they are trapped in behavioral patterns that were created by decades of institutional life. Their presence ensures that the lessons learned from this experiment in solitary confinement continue to influence modern corrections practices. Mike believes that the spirits of Eastern State represent the human capacity for survival under the most difficult circumstances, but also the psychological cost of systems that treat prisoners as less than human. Their ongoing presence serves as a call for criminal justice approaches that recognize the dignity and potential for rehabilitation in every incarcerated individual, ensuring that future generations learn from the mistakes of the past.
Story 3. The echoing voices of Beelitz Hallstetten. Medical historian Dr. Sarah Klein had studied abandoned hospitals throughout Europe, but her research at Beelitz Hallstetten in Germany became the most haunting experience of her academic career. The massive sanatorium complex had been built in the 1890s to treat tuberculosis patients, and later served as a military hospital during both World Wars. After decades of abandonment, Dr. Klein was granted access to conduct research on the evolution of medical architecture, but she discovered that the buildings held more than just historical artifacts. Beelitz Hallstetten had originally been designed as a model tuberculosis sanatorium, featuring innovative medical architecture intended to promote healing through fresh air, sunlight, and peaceful surroundings. The complex consisted of over 60 buildings spread across 500 acres, including separate facilities for men, women, and children. During its operation from 1898 to 1994, the sanatorium had treated hundreds of thousands of patients, including wounded soldiers from both World Wars and civilians suffering from tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. Klein arrived at Beelitz Hallstetten on a foggy autumn morning, immediately struck by the haunting beauty of the abandoned buildings. The red brick structures with their distinctive architecture were slowly being reclaimed by nature, with trees growing through floors and ivy covering entire facades. The complex felt like a lost city, with streets, squares, and individual buildings that had once housed a thriving medical community. Most of the structures had been empty for decades, creating an eerie silence that was broken only by the wind through broken windows. Dr. Klein's research focused on documenting the architectural features that had been designed to promote patient recovery, the orientation of buildings to maximize sunlight, the placement of balconies for fresh air therapy, and the design of patient rooms to provide both privacy and medical access. As she worked through the abandoned wards, she found remnants of medical equipment, patient belongings, and architectural details that revealed the evolution of tuberculosis treatment over nearly a century. The first supernatural encounter occurred while Dr. Klein was photographing the former children's tuberculosis pavilion. She was documenting the architectural features of a children's ward when she heard what sounded like children coughing in the distance. The coughing had the distinctive sound she recognized from medical literature about tuberculosis, the persistent racking cough that characterized advanced lung disease. When she investigated the source of the sounds, she found the building completely empty. Over the next several days, the phantom coughing became a constant presence throughout the complex. Dr. Klein would hear individual patients coughing, and sometimes what sounded like entire wards filled with people suffering from respiratory distress. The sounds were most prominent in the patient areas, the dormitories, treatment rooms, and outdoor balconies, where patients had received fresh air therapy. The phantom coughing created an audio landscape of a functioning tuberculosis sanatorium. Dr. Klein began seeing the sources of the coughing sounds. Phantom patients appeared throughout the complex, going about their daily routines, as if the sanatorium was still operational. She saw patients resting on invisible beds, taking walks through the corridors, with the slow pace of people conserving their breath, and gathering on balconies for the fresh air treatments that had been central to tuberculosis therapy. The patients wore hospital clothing from different eras, representing the decades of medical care that had taken place in the buildings. The children's area was particularly active with supernatural phenomena. Dr. Klein regularly saw phantom children playing in former playrooms, attending invisible classes in the educational areas, and receiving medical treatments from phantom nurses and doctors. The child patients appeared to be from different time periods, including young tuberculosis patients from the early 1900s and children who had been treated for various conditions throughout the sanatorium's later years of operation. Dr. Klein's medical historical training helped her recognize the treatments and procedures she was witnessing in the phantom scenes. She observed patients receiving the fresh air therapy that had been standard tuberculosis treatment before the development of antibiotics. She saw phantom medical staff conducting examinations, administering medications, and providing the supportive care that had been the primary treatment option for tuberculosis patients. The accuracy of these medical presentations convinced her that she was observing genuine spiritual recordings of historical medical practice. The research took on new dimensions as Dr. Klein realized she was documenting not just architectural history, but the ongoing spiritual presence of the medical community that had once thrived at Bielitz-Hallstetten. She began incorporating her supernatural observations into her research, arguing that places where significant medical care occurred often retained spiritual impressions of that healing work. The phantom patients and medical staff represented the continuation of medical mission that had defined the sanatorium's purpose. Klein's most significant encounter occurred in the former surgical suite, where she witnessed what appeared to be a complex medical procedure being performed by phantom surgeons on an invisible patient. The spiritual medical team followed historically accurate surgical procedures, and Dr. Klein could identify specific techniques that had been used during different eras of the sanatorium's operation. The phantom surgery lasted for over 2 hours, demonstrating the skill and dedication of medical professionals who had worked under difficult conditions to save lives. The supernatural activity extended to the areas that had served as military hospitals during the World Wars. Dr. Klein encountered phantom soldiers receiving treatment for war wounds, attended by phantom medical staff who had worked under the pressure of wartime conditions. These scenes revealed the sanatorium's role in treating not just tuberculosis patients, but wounded soldiers who had been brought from battlefields across Europe. The phantom soldiers appeared to be from both world wars, representing the decades of military medical care provided at the facility. Dr. Klein began researching individual cases to understand the people whose spirits she was encountering. She found records of patients who had spent months or years at the sanatorium, receiving treatment for tuberculosis and other conditions. Many patients had been separated from their families for extended periods, living in the medical community that developed within the sanatorium walls. Some patients had recovered and returned to their communities, while others had died at the facility after long battles with their illnesses. One particularly moving encounter involved a young woman who appeared to be writing letters at an invisible desk in a former patient room. Through sanatorium records, Dr. Klein identified her as Anna Muller, a tuberculosis patient who had been at Bielitz-Hallstetten from 1923 to 1925. Anna had been known for writing detailed letters to her family, documenting her treatment and maintaining hope for recovery, despite the progression of her disease. She had died at the sanatorium in 1925, but her letters had been preserved in the facility's archives. The phantom patients at Bielitz-Hallstetten, according to Dr. Klein's interpretation, represent the healing mission that had defined the sanatorium's purpose throughout its nearly century of operation.
Unlike the tortured spirits found at institutions where patients had suffered abuse or neglect, the spirits at Willard's seemed peaceful and purposeful, continuing their participation in a medical community that had been dedicated to healing and recovery. Dr. Klein's research expanded to include the spiritual dimension of medical architecture, arguing that buildings designed for healing retain positive spiritual energy that continues to influence the spaces long after medical operations cease. The phantom patients and medical staff at Willard's Hallstatten demonstrated that places dedicated to compassionate medical care could become spiritual sanctuaries where healing continues on a supernatural level. The documentation of supernatural activity at Willard's Hallstatten contributed to Dr. Klein's groundbreaking research on the relationship between architectural design and spiritual energy in medical facilities. Her work suggested that buildings designed with genuine concern for patient welfare and healing create environments that attract positive spiritual activity, while facilities designed primarily for containment or control develop more negative supernatural phenomena. According to Dr. Klein's findings, Willard's Hallstatten represents a model of how medical facilities can serve as places of genuine healing that continues beyond the lives of individual patients and medical staff. The phantom patients demonstrate that the healing mission of medicine can transcend death, creating spiritual communities where compassionate care continues indefinitely. The sanatorium serves as a reminder that medical facilities designed with love, hope, and dedication to healing create legacies that persist long after the last patient has been discharged and the final medical procedure has been completed. Dr. Klein continues her research on medical architecture and spiritual phenomena, using her experiences at Willard's Hallstatten as a foundation for understanding how the physical design of medical facilities influences both the healing process and the spiritual energy that persists in these spaces. Her work has influenced modern hospital design, encouraging architects to consider the long-term spiritual impact of medical buildings on the communities they serve.
Story 4. The Phantom Patients of Danvers State Hospital. When maintenance worker Tom Bradley took a job at the former Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, he thought he was getting easy money for cleaning up an old building. The massive Gothic structure had been abandoned since 1992, and developers were planning to convert it into condominiums. Tom's job was simple: secure the building, clean out debris, and make sure nobody was breaking in. What he found inside made him question his sanity. Danvers State Hospital had operated from 1878 to 1992 as a psychiatric facility. During its peak years, over 2,000 patients lived in conditions that were more like a prison than a hospital. The building was designed to be therapeutic, with long corridors and plenty of windows, but overcrowding turned it into a nightmare. Patients were packed into rooms meant for half their number, and treatments included lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and experimental drugs that often did more harm than good. Tom started his first day on a cold October morning in 2005. The building was enormous, 4 stories tall with wings stretching in every direction. Most of the windows were boarded up, but enough light filtered through to see the destruction inside. Graffiti covered the walls, debris littered the floors, and the smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. Tom figured it would take months to clear everything out. The first strange thing happened on his 3rd day. Tom was working on the 2nd floor, pulling out old furniture and medical equipment, when he heard voices coming from down the hall. They sounded like people having a conversation, but when he went to investigate, the hallway was empty. The voices seemed to be coming from behind the walls themselves. Tom checked the building plans and found that there were no hidden rooms or spaces where people could be hiding. Over the next week, the voices became a regular occurrence. Tom would hear patients talking to nurses, doctors giving orders, and sometimes screaming or crying that would echo through the empty corridors. The sounds always seemed to be just around the corner or behind the next door, but whenever Tom investigated, he found nothing but empty rooms filled with debris. Tom tried to rationalize what he was hearing. Old buildings made strange noises, and his imagination might be playing tricks on him. but the voices were too clear and too specific. He could make out conversations about medications, treatments, and daily routines that matched what he knew about how psychiatric hospitals operated. The voices weren't random noise, they were the sounds of a functioning hospital from decades past. The situation got worse when Tom started seeing things. While cleaning out a former patient room, he saw a figure in a hospital gown standing by the window. The person was thin and pale, staring out at the grounds with a vacant expression. When Tom called out, the figure turned toward him, and Tom could see it was an elderly man with deep-set eyes and hollow cheeks. The man looked directly at Tom for several seconds, then simply faded away. Tom reported the incident to his supervisor, but the building's security cameras showed nothing unusual. Tom had been alone in the room the entire time, and there was no evidence that anyone else had been there. His supervisor suggested that Tom might be stressed from working alone in such a depressing environment, but Tom knew what he had seen. The encounters became more frequent. Tom would see patients walking through the halls, sitting in rooms, or standing at windows. They all wore the same type of hospital clothing and had the same vacant, medicated expressions. Most disturbing was that they seemed unaware of Tom's presence. They went about their routines as if the hospital was still operating, following schedules and patterns that had ended over a decade ago. One morning, Tom encountered what appeared to be a group therapy session in the former recreation room. About 15 patients sat in a circle while a woman in a nurse's uniform led them in some kind of discussion. Tom could hear fragments of conversation about medications and treatment plans. He watched the scene for nearly 10 minutes before it gradually faded away, leaving him alone in the empty room. Tom began researching the hospital's history, hoping to understand what he was experiencing. What he learned made the encounters even more disturbing. Danvers State Hospital had been overcrowded and understaffed for most of its existence. Patients often received inadequate care, and many died from neglect or harsh treatments. The hospital had been the site of numerous patient deaths, suicides, and incidents of abuse by staff members. The most shocking discovery was that many patients had been forgotten by their families and buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. Tom found records indicating that over 700 people were buried in the hospital cemetery, most without proper headstones or identification. These were people who had been abandoned by society and died alone in an institution that was supposed to help them. As Tom continued his work, he began to feel a connection to the phantom patients he was seeing. They seemed to be trapped in the building, endlessly repeating the routines of their final years. Tom started talking to them, even though they never responded. He would say good morning to patients he saw in the halls and wish them well when he left each day. The most emotional encounter happened in the former children's ward. Tom was cleaning out a playroom when he saw several young patients, some no older than 8 or 9, playing with invisible toys. The children looked sad and lost, dressed in hospital gowns that were too big for their small bodies. Tom learned that Danvers had housed children with developmental disabilities and mental health issues, many of whom had been abandoned by their families. Tom's experience reached a turning point when he found a patient file that had been left behind in an old desk. The file belonged to Margaret Sullivan, a woman who had been admitted in 1951 for what would now be recognized as severe depression. Margaret had received electroshock treatments and experimental medications that left her in a vegetative state. She had died at the hospital in 1967, with no family members present at her death. That afternoon, Tom saw Margaret in her former room. She was sitting on an invisible bed, staring out the window with the same expression shown in her patient photograph. Tom spoke to her gently, telling her that people remembered her and that her suffering was acknowledged. For the first time, one of the phantom patients seemed to hear him. Margaret turned toward Tom, smiled slightly, and then faded away peacefully. Word of Tom's experiences spread among the construction crew, and several other workers reported similar encounters. Some quit rather than continue working in the building. Others, like Tom, felt a responsibility to bear witness to what they were seeing. The phantom patients seemed to be seeking acknowledgement, some recognition that their lives had mattered and their suffering had been real. The developers eventually completed their conversion of Danvers State Hospital into luxury condominiums, but many of the residents report ongoing supernatural activity. They hear voices in the hallways, see figures in hospital gowns, and experience unexplained cold spots throughout their apartments. Tom believes the phantom patients remain because they died in a place where they had been forgotten and abandoned, and their spirits continue to seek the human connection they were denied in life. Tom now works at a different facility, but he visits the Danvers site regularly to pay his respects to the patients he encountered. He has become an advocate for mental health awareness and works to ensure that the history of places like Danvers is not forgotten. According to Tom, the phantom patients serve as a reminder that behind every mental health statistic is a human being who deserves compassion, dignity, and remembrance. Story 5: The Screaming Tunnels of Willard Asylum. Security guard Maria Santos thought she had heard every kind of noise during her 20 years working at various abandoned buildings. But nothing prepared her for her assignment at the former Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane in upstate New York. The massive institution had been closed since 1995, and Maria was hired to patrol the grounds while the state decided what to do with the property. Her first night on the job, she discovered why previous security guards had quit after just a few days. Willard Asylum had operated from 1869 to 1995, housing patients with chronic mental illnesses who were considered untreatable by the medical standards of their time. The facility was built on the shores of Seneca Lake, intended to provide a peaceful environment for long-term care. In reality, Willard became a place where families sent relatives they wanted to forget. Many patients lived at the asylum for decades, and some died there without ever receiving a single visitor. Maria began her first shift at sunset on a November evening. The asylum consisted of multiple buildings connected by underground tunnels, allowing staff and patients to move between structures without going outside during harsh winters. The tunnel system was extensive, stretching for miles beneath the complex. Maria's job was to patrol these tunnels throughout the night, checking for intruders and monitoring the buildings for any signs of damage or vandalism. The tunnels were immediately unsettling. Dim emergency lighting cast long shadows on the concrete walls, and the sound of Maria's footsteps echoed endlessly in both directions. The tunnels were lined with old pipes, electrical conduits, and ventilation systems that created a constant background hum. But within hours of starting her patrol, Maria began hearing sounds that didn't match the building's mechanical systems. The first incident occurred around midnight. Maria was walking through the main tunnel that connected the administration building to the patient dormitories when she heard what sounded like someone screaming in the distance. The scream was human, desperate, and filled with terror. It echoed through the tunnels for several seconds before fading away. Maria immediately radioed for backup and began searching the area, but she found no evidence that anyone else was in the building. Maria tried to dismiss the incident as her imagination or perhaps the sound of wind moving through the building's ventilation system. But over the next several hours, the screaming became a regular occurrence. Sometimes it sounded like a single person in distress, other times like multiple voices crying out simultaneously. The screams always seemed to come from deeper in the tunnel system, leading Maria further away from the exits and into areas that had been sealed off for years. As Maria investigated the source of the sounds, she began to learn about the tunnel system's dark history. During the asylum's operation, the tunnels had been used to transport patients who were being moved between buildings for different types of treatment. Some of these treatments were experimental and often harmful, including ice baths, restraints, and primitive forms of electroshock therapy. Patients who resisted or became violent were often dragged through the tunnels against their will. The most disturbing discovery was that the tunnels had also been used to transport bodies. When patients died at Willard, their bodies were moved through the underground system to avoid upsetting other patients. Over the asylum's 126 years of operation, thousands of patients had died at the facility, and their final journey had been through these same tunnels that Maria was now patrolling. Maria's encounters with the supernatural escalated during her second week on the job. While walking through a section of tunnel beneath the former treatment building, she saw a figure running toward her in the distance. The figure appeared to be wearing a hospital gown and was moving with desperate urgency, as if fleeing from something terrifying. As the figure got closer, Maria could see it was a middle-aged woman with wild hair and terror in her eyes. The woman ran directly toward Maria, screaming for help, but passed right through her without making physical contact. Maria felt a sudden drop in temperature and experienced intense emotions that weren't her own: fear, desperation, and overwhelming panic. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, but Maria was left shaking and confused. She had never experienced anything like it in her years of security work. Research into the asylum's records revealed the likely identity of the running woman. Eleanor Patterson had been a patient at Willard from 1923 to 1954, admitted for what her family described as hysteria, but was probably severe anxiety or depression. Eleanor had repeatedly tried to escape from the asylum, and hospital records documented numerous incidents where she had to be physically restrained and returned to her room. She had died during an attempted escape, found in the tunnels after suffering what appeared to be a heart attack brought on by extreme stress. Maria began encountering Eleanor's spirit regularly during her patrols. The phantom woman would appear at different locations in the tunnel system, always running, always terrified, always screaming for help. Maria tried to communicate with the apparition, but Eleanor seemed trapped in an endless loop of her final escape attempt, unable to recognize that decades had passed since her death. Other spirits began appearing as well. Maria encountered patients who seemed to be lost in the tunnels, wandering aimlessly as if searching for something they could never find. She saw groups of patients being led through the tunnels by invisible staff members, moving toward treatments they would never receive. Most disturbing were the spirits who appeared to be in physical distress, crying out in pain from procedures that had ended decades ago. The psychological impact of these encounters was severe. Maria began experiencing nightmares about being trapped in the asylum as a patient. She would wake up feeling claustrophobic and anxious, with the sensation that the tunnel walls were closing in around her. During her waking hours, she found herself thinking about the patients whose spirits she was encountering, wondering about their lives before the asylum and the families who had abandoned them. Maria's supervisor initially dismissed her reports as stress-related hallucinations, but other staff members who had worked at Willard over the years confirmed similar experiences. Maintenance workers had reported seeing figures in the tunnels, and cleaning staff had refused to work alone in certain areas of the complex. The state employees who managed the property knew about the supernatural activity but kept it quiet to avoid negative publicity. The situation reached a crisis point when Maria encountered what appeared to be a mass spiritual event in the main tunnel. She was conducting her routine patrol when she saw dozens of patients filling the tunnel ahead of her. They were all moving in the same direction, toward the area where the asylum cemetery was located. The patients appeared to be from different eras of the hospital's operation, wearing various styles of patient clothing from the 1800s through the 1990s. Maria followed the procession through the tunnels, watching as the spirits moved with purpose and determination. They seemed to be aware of each other but not of Maria's presence. The procession continued for nearly an hour, with patients joining from side tunnels until hundreds of spirits were moving together through the underground system. The scene was both beautiful and heartbreaking, the souls of forgotten patients finally coming together after decades of isolation. The procession ended at a tunnel entrance that led to the asylum cemetery, where over 5,000 patients were buried, most in unmarked graves. As the spirits reached this point, they began to fade away one by one, until Maria was left alone in the tunnel. She understood that she had witnessed the spirits of Willard's patients making their final journey to the peace they had been denied in life. Maria continued working at Willard for another 6 months, but the emotional toll of her encounters eventually forced her to resign. She had become deeply affected by the stories of the patients she met, and she felt a responsibility to ensure their experiences were not forgotten. Maria began volunteering with mental health organizations and advocating for better treatment of people with psychiatric conditions. The Willard Asylum property was eventually sold to developers, but the tunnel system remains largely intact. Current security personnel continue to report supernatural activity, including the sounds of screaming and sightings of patients moving through the underground corridors. Maria believes the spirits remain because they died in a place where they had been forgotten by society, and their presence serves as a reminder of the need for compassion in mental health treatment. According to Maria's experience, the screaming tunnels of Willard represent the collective voice of patients who suffered in silence during their lifetimes. Their ongoing presence ensures that their stories are not completely forgotten and that future generations understand the human cost of inadequate mental health care. The spirits are not trying to frighten the living, but rather to bear witness to their suffering and to demand that society remember the people who were abandoned to institutions like Willard Asylum. Story 6. The Shadow Children of Penn State School. Photographer Jake Morrison specialized in documenting abandoned buildings, but his assignment at Penn State School in Pennsylvania changed his entire perspective on his work. What had started as a routine photo shoot for a magazine article about abandoned institutions became a supernatural encounter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jake thought he was documenting empty buildings, but he discovered that Penhust was far from empty. Penn State School had operated from 1908 to 1987 as an institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The facility was designed to house and educate individuals who were considered unable to live independently in society. However, Penhust became notorious for horrific conditions, abuse, and neglect that were exposed in a famous 1968 television documentary. By the time it closed, the institution had become a symbol of society's mistreatment of vulnerable populations. Jake arrived at Penhust on a gray March morning, equipped with professional cameras and lighting equipment. The complex was massive, with over 30 buildings spread across 1,400 acres. Most of the structures were red brick with white trim, designed to look institutional but not threatening. However, decades of abandonment had left the buildings in serious decay, with broken windows, collapsed roofs, and graffiti covering many surfaces. Jake's plan was to spend 3 days photographing different areas of the complex, focusing on the contrast between the building's original purpose and their current abandoned state. He began in the administration building, where he found old records, furniture, and equipment scattered throughout the rooms. The photographs were compelling: empty wheelchairs, overturned desks, and patient files that told stories of lives spent in institutional care. On his second day, while photographing in Building 6, Jake began noticing shadows that didn't correspond to any physical objects. The shadows appeared to be child-sized, moving independently of any light sources. At first, Jake assumed they were tricks of light caused by his photography equipment, but the shadows appeared even when he wasn't using artificial lighting. They seemed to be aware of his presence, moving away when he approached and clustering in areas he had already photographed. Jake's camera began capturing images that he couldn't explain. In photographs of empty rooms, he found childlike figures that weren't visible to his naked eye. The figures appeared translucent and wore clothing that looked like the uniforms residents would have worn during the institution's operation. The children in the photographs looked sad and lost, with expressions that reflected years of institutional life. The most disturbing discovery came when Jake was photographing the former children's dormitory. This building had housed the youngest residents of Penhust, some as young as 5 years old. Many of these children had been abandoned by their families and had no visitors during their entire stay at the institution. Jake found old toys, cribs, and children's clothing scattered throughout the building, remnants of lives lived in institutional care. While working in the dormitory, Jake began hearing children's voices. The sounds were faint but clearly human children talking, laughing, and sometimes crying. The voices seemed to come from all directions, as if invisible children were playing throughout the building. Jake recorded audio during his photography sessions and later confirmed that his equipment had captured the sounds of children speaking, even though the building had been empty for decades. Jake's research into Penhust's history revealed the tragic circumstances that had led to so many children being institutionalized. During the early and mid-20th century, families were often told that children with disabilities would be better cared for in institutions. Many parents were convinced to surrender their children to places like Penhust, believing they were doing what was best for their disabled child. In reality, these children often received inadequate care and lived in overcrowded, understaffed facilities. The most heartbreaking discovery was that many children had died at Penhust, either from neglect, inadequate medical care, or accidents caused by dangerous conditions. Jake found records indicating that over 900 people had died during Pennhust's operation, including many children who had lived at the institution for most of their short lives. These children were often buried in unmarked graves on the facility's grounds, with no family members present at their funerals. Jake's supernatural encounters intensified as he continued his photography project. He began seeing the shadow children more clearly, and they seemed to be trying to communicate with him. The children would point to specific areas of buildings, as if directing his attention to particular locations. When Jake followed their guidance, he often found evidence of the conditions they had lived in. Restraints, isolation rooms, and medical equipment that revealed the harsh realities of institutional life. The most emotional encounter occurred in the former school building, where residents had received educational services. Jake was photographing empty classrooms when he saw a group of shadow children sitting at desks, apparently engaged in a lesson. The children appeared to be of various ages, all wearing the same style of institutional clothing. They seemed happy and engaged, possibly recreating one of the few positive experiences they had during their time at Pennhust. Jake began talking to the shadow children, explaining who he was and why he was there. While they never responded verbally, the children seemed to understand his purpose. They began appearing more frequently in his photographs, as if posing for pictures they had never been allowed to take during their lifetimes. Jake felt a responsibility to document their presence and to tell their stories through his photographs. The photography project expanded beyond its original scope as Jake became emotionally invested in the children's stories. He spent weeks researching individual cases, trying to identify specific children who had lived and died at Pennhust. He found photographs of residents from the institution's archives and was shocked to discover that several of the shadow children he had been seeing matched the appearance of children who had died at the facility decades earlier. One photograph particularly affected Jake, an image of a young boy named Tommy Williams who had lived at Pennhust from 1955 until his death in 1967 at age 12. Tommy had been born with cerebral palsy and had been institutionalized when his parents could no longer care for him. He had never received visitors during his 12 years at Pennhust and had died alone in the institution's infirmary. Jake had been seeing Tommy's shadow regularly throughout his photography project. Jake's final encounter with the shadow children occurred in the institution's former chapel, where residents had attended religious services. As Jake photographed the empty space, dozens of shadow children appeared, filling the pews as if attending a service. The children sat quietly and respectfully, just as they would have during actual religious services decades earlier. Jake felt honored to witness this spiritual gathering and understood that the children were showing him one of the few peaceful experiences from their institutional lives. The photography project resulted in a powerful exhibition that traveled to galleries across the country, raising awareness about the history of institutionalization and the treatment of people with disabilities. Jake's photographs of the shadow children sparked discussions about society's responsibility to its most vulnerable members, and the need to remember the people who had suffered in places like Pennhust. Jake continued his work documenting abandoned institutions, but his approach changed completely after his experience at Pennhust. He now focuses on telling the stories of the people who lived in these places, rather than simply documenting empty buildings. His photographs serve as memorials to the individuals who were forgotten by society and died in institutional care. According to Jake's interpretation, the shadow children of Pennhust remained because they died in a place where they had been abandoned by their families and forgotten by society. Their presence serves as a reminder that people with disabilities deserve love, care, and dignity, not institutionalization and neglect. The children are not trying to frighten visitors, but rather to ensure that their lives are remembered and that their stories contribute to better treatment of vulnerable populations. Jake believes that places like Pennhust hold the spiritual energy of the people who suffered there, and this energy will persist until society fully acknowledges the wrongs that were committed and commits to never repeating them. The shadow children represent not just individual tragedies, but the collective failure of a society that chose to hide away its most vulnerable members rather than finding ways to support and include them in community life. Story 7. The Phantom Patients of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Nurse Rebecca Chin had worked in hospitals for 15 years before taking a job as a tour guide at the historic Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky. The massive tuberculosis hospital had been converted into a tourist attraction, offering guided tours and overnight paranormal investigations. Rebecca thought her medical background would help her provide educational tours about the history of tuberculosis treatment. She never expected to encounter patients who had been dead for decades. Waverly Hills Sanatorium had operated from 1910 to 1961 as a tuberculosis hospital, treating patients during one of the deadliest epidemics in American history. The facility was designed to provide the best possible care using the medical knowledge of the time, which included fresh air therapy, rest, and nutritious food. However, before the development of antibiotics, tuberculosis had a mortality rate approaching 50%. Over 63,000 people had died at Waverly Hills during its 51 years of operation. Rebecca began working at Waverly Hills in the spring, leading daytime tours for visitors interested in medical history. The building was genuinely impressive, a 5-story concrete structure built on a hilltop to provide patients with fresh air and sunlight. The design included spacious patient rooms, outdoor porches for air therapy, and a solarium where patients could rest in the sun. However, decades of abandonment had left the building in significant decay. Rebecca's first supernatural encounter occurred during her second week on the job. She was leading a tour group through the 3rd floor, which had housed adult patients, when she saw a woman in a white hospital gown standing at the end of the hallway. The woman appeared to be a patient, thin and pale with the characteristic appearance of someone suffering from advanced tuberculosis. When Rebecca called out to ask if she needed help, the woman simply vanished. Initially, Rebecca assumed she had seen another employee or perhaps a visitor who had separated from their tour group. But when she checked with the other tour guides, no one was missing from their groups, and no employees were working on the 3rd floor at that time. Rebecca began paying closer attention during her tours, and she soon realized that she was seeing patients regularly throughout the building. The phantom patients appeared to be going about their daily routines as if the hospital was still operational. Rebecca saw patients resting on invisible beds, walking slowly through the corridors with the careful movements of people suffering from lung disease, and sitting by windows looking out at the grounds. The patients wore hospital clothing from different eras, suggesting that spirits from throughout Waverly Hills' operational history were present in the building. Rebecca's medical training helped her recognize the symptoms and behaviors she was observing in the phantom patients. Many showed signs of advanced tuberculosis, extreme thinness, pale complexions, and the slow, careful movements of people struggling to breathe. Others appeared to be in earlier stages of the disease, moving with more energy but still showing the telltale signs of chronic illness. The accuracy of these medical presentations convinced Rebecca that she was seeing genuine spiritual manifestations rather than hallucinations. The encounters became more interactive as Rebecca spent more time in the building. Phantom patients began acknowledging her presence, nodding or waving as she passed. Some patients seemed to recognize her medical uniform and would approach her as if seeking help or comfort. Rebecca found herself responding professionally, offering reassurance and kind words even though she knew the patients had been dead for decades. The most emotional encounters occurred in the children's ward on the 4th floor. Waverly Hills had treated hundreds of children with tuberculosis, many of whom had been separated from their families for months or years during treatment. Rebecca regularly saw phantom children playing in the former playroom, lying in invisible beds, or standing by windows looking for parents who would never come. The sight of these sick children, forever trapped in their final illness, was heartbreaking for Rebecca. Rebecca began researching specific patients whose spirits she encountered regularly. One phantom child appeared to be about 8 years old, with blonde hair and sad eyes. Through hospital records, Rebecca identified her as Mary Hillenberg, who had died at Waverly Hills in 1928 at age 7. Mary had been at the hospital for 2 years, receiving treatment for tuberculosis that had spread to her bones and spine. She had died without any family members present, as her parents had been too afraid of infection to visit. The research revealed the tragic reality of tuberculosis treatment in the early 20th century. Families were often advised to minimize contact with infected relatives to prevent the spread of disease. Many patients spent their final months or years in isolation, visited only by medical staff who were themselves at risk of infection. The emotional isolation was often as devastating as the physical disease, and many patients died feeling abandoned by the world outside the hospital. Rebecca's most significant encounter occurred in room 502, which was notorious among paranormal investigators for supernatural activity. The room had been where many patients had died, and it was also the site where a nurse had committed suicide in 1928. Rebecca was leading a tour group through the room when she saw both a phantom patient and what appeared to be the ghost of the nurse who had taken her own life. The phantom patient was a young man in his 20s, lying in an invisible bed and struggling to breathe. The nurse spirit was standing beside the bed, checking on the patient with the same professional attention Rebecca recognized from her own nursing practice. The scene lasted for several minutes, allowing Rebecca to observe the compassionate care that nurses had provided even in the face of a largely incurable disease. When the spirits faded away, Rebecca felt a deep connection to the healthcare workers who had served at Waverly Hills. Rebecca's tours began incorporating her supernatural encounters as she realized that the phantom patients were an integral part of Waverly Hills' ongoing story. She would point out areas where she regularly saw patients and share what she had learned about their individual stories. Tour groups were initially skeptical, but many visitors began reporting their own sightings of patients throughout the building. The overnight paranormal investigations provided even more dramatic encounters. Rebecca would participate as a medical consultant, helping investigate teams understand the historical context of what they were experiencing. During these investigations, she witnessed group manifestations where dozens of phantom patients would appear simultaneously, recreating scenes from the hospital's daily operations. One particularly powerful investigation took place in the former surgery suite, where experimental treatments had been attempted on patients with advanced tuberculosis. Rebecca's work at Waverly Hills expanded beyond tour guiding as she became an expert on the hospital's history and paranormal activity. She began giving presentations at medical conferences about the intersection of healthcare history and supernatural phenomena, arguing that locations where significant medical care occurred often retained spiritual impressions of that healing work. The phantom patients at Waverly Hills, according to Rebecca's interpretation, represent the dedication and compassion that characterized tuberculosis treatment despite the limitations of early 20th century medicine. The patients remain in the building not because they are trapped or angry, but because they are still receiving the care and attention they needed during their final illness. The spirits of healthcare workers continue to tend to patients who died decades ago, providing comfort that extends beyond death. Rebecca believes that Waverly Hills serves as a spiritual hospital where healing continues in the supernatural realm. The phantom patients are finally receiving the family visits and emotional support they were denied during their lifetimes, as modern visitors to the building provide the human connection these patients desperately needed. The ongoing spiritual activity represents not horror, but healing, a continuation of the medical mission that began when Waverly Hills first opened its doors. According to Rebecca's experience, the phantom patients teach modern healthcare workers about the importance of compassionate care and the need to see patients as complete human beings rather than just medical cases. The spirits of Waverly Hills remind us that healing involves not just medical treatment, but emotional support, human dignity, and the assurance that no one should face illness alone. Their presence ensures that the lessons learned during the tuberculosis epidemic continue to influence medical practice today.